Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. Haere aki nei. Attacks on alleged war crimes. New Zealand slaps a 35% tariff on all Russian imports in the face of emerging atrocities. We talk to a US State Department official who likens Putin's alleged war crimes to those of Nazi Germany and warns nothing is off the table when it comes to further sanctions against Russia. He made it onto tote bags and tea towels. Our most recognisable public servant, Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, hands in his notice. A call for more pharmacy-supervised rat tests. And the first COVID lockdown apparently turned us into couch potatoes, and exercise rates haven't bounced back to pre-pandemic levels. So what is going to get us off our bums? Yep, talking to you.
RNZ News at 5. Good afternoon. Ahi Marie. I'm Evie Ashton. A top US official has thanked New Zealand for putting sanctions on Russia, saying the move will support Ukraine. The government's announced it's bringing in 35% tariffs on all Russian imports in the latest round of measures designed to punish Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. US Department of State Director of the Eastern European Division, John Armstrong, says the sanctions New Zealand has placed on Russia contribute to the international pressure.
We appreciate what you've done on bringing in your sanctions legislation. That truly shows New Zealand's support and commitment to the people of Ukraine.
You can hear the full interview with John Armstrong on Checkpoint shortly. 3 top health chiefs have resigned, leaving major gaps at the highest levels of the health system. The Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, is citing stress as the reason he'll leave the job at the end of July. The Health Ministry has also confirmed that the Director of Public Health, Caroline McElnay, is stepping down, and her Deputy Director of Public Health, Nikki Stefanogiannis, is leaving. Dr Bloomfield has said he's confident processes are in place to respond to the COVID pandemic after he departs. The Prime Minister has thanked Dr Bloomfield for his tireless dedication and considered approach during the COVID-19 pandemic. Jacinda Ardern says the country owes him a great deal.
I cannot imagine someone who is a better example of what being a true public servant is. He has been tireless, he has been dedicated, he has taken an enormous load, and he's contributed to the success that New Zealand has had in keeping people safe through this pandemic.
Dr Bloomfield says he'll take an extended break and then return to public service. An Auckland University epidemiologist wants pharmacies to perform rapid antigen tests to improve their accuracy. There are increasing reports of people having the virus but recording negative rats, sometimes multiple times. Professor Rod Jackson says it's not surprising.
If it's done at home, it might miss up to 50% of positives. If it's done by someone who's skilled, you might get up to 80% plus.
Professor Jackson says doing rats at pharmacies will also mean the results are recorded. The Ministry of Health says it's possible for someone with COVID-19 to record a negative rat result. This can be because there's not enough virus in the sample or the test isn't carried out correctly. It says there are step-by-step instructions on the Ministry's website. New Zealand researchers believe financial and social pressures are forcing people to return to work before they've fully recovered from COVID. Post-viral brain fog normally stops within 6 weeks of infection, but long COVID is diagnosed when symptoms last more than 12 weeks. Te Wanaka Senior Research Fellow, Dr. Mona Jeffries, says the week of isolation is by no means a reflection of recovery time.
Mental energy expenditure can be the thing that tips you over from being able to fully recover from COVID into the longer-term long COVID. But we understand that there are huge pressures on people to pay rent, to pay bills, to pay for food.
Dr. Mona Jeffries hopes the government will extend sick leave and provide disability support for people who develop long COVID. And Airbnb has labelled new home sharing regulations in Christchurch as restrictive and outdated. The council has agreed to require resource consent for all short-term accommodation providers, with more rigorous regulations for houses who host over 6 guests for more than 60 nights a year. An Airbnb spokesperson says the new rules will make it harder for people to earn extra income through their homes to combat the rising costs of living. But the council says home share providers are essentially operating a business and should comply with the same rules as other businesses. In sport, 5-time champion Tiger Woods is confident he can add a 6th US Masters golf title to his resume, but he's concerned about simply walking Augusta's 72 holes. The golfing great has confirmed he'll play at this year's tournament as long as he comes through another practice round tomorrow. Woods is still recovering from a car crash 14 months ago and hasn't played on the PGA Tour since the 2020 Masters.
I can hit it just fine. Walking is the hard part. This is normally not a easy walk to begin with. Now, given the conditions that my leg is in, it gets a little bit more difficult.
New Zealand Rugby believes the rash of red cards in Super Rugby is an anomaly and is confident new guidelines around dangerous play will reduce concussions. 4 players were sent off in New Zealand games last round, with Blues wing Caleb Clark facing the judiciary tonight. All the cards followed contact to the head and neck, but the NZR's national referee manager, Bryce Lawrence, doesn't believe it's a cause for concern.
There's no difference to last year where across the 2 Super in Aussie and New Zealand, we ended up with about 1 red card in every 5 games, and the stats exactly the same this year, if not a little lower. I actually think last week was a bit of a one-off.
Auckland's wrapped up the Plunket Shield cricket title after scoring more than 200 runs in their penultimate match against Northern Districts to secure the single point they needed to win the trophy. And Liverpool have taken a firm grip of their Champions League quarter-final tie with Benfica, scoring a 3-1 first leg win in Lisbon. Manchester City beat Atletico Madrid 1-0. That's the news.
More wealth for Elon Musk.
If the bank has your house, how do you get your house back? You buy the bank. This is going to be a new Twitter with him on the board.
More fury at Russia.
Every lie we hear from the Russian representative is more evidence that they do not belong on the Human Rights Council.
And looking for answers in the battle against climate change.
What we're seeing here, in a sense, is the UN grabbing the world by the shoulders and shaking it, saying, don't you get it? Time is really running out. You have to act now.
The Big News programme, Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
And you can download the RNZ app to your phone to listen live or listen again. You're with Lisa Owen on Checkpoint next. First, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Thursday. From Northland to Kapiti Coast, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and the Central High Country. Partly cloudy with a few showers, possibly thundery about the Eastern Bay of Plenty ranges today, clearing and becoming fine tomorrow. Gisborne to Wairarapa and Wellington, mostly fine. A few showers spreading from the south this evening, clearing Wellington and Wairarapa tomorrow afternoon. For inland Marlborough, Nelson, Bulla and Westland, rain is clearing Bulla this afternoon, otherwise isolated showers are clearing tomorrow morning. For coastal Marlborough and Canterbury, mostly cloudy with a few showers, becoming fine tomorrow afternoon. For Otago, Southland and Fiordland, occasional showers. Thunderstorms and gale southwesterlies are possible about the coast until the evening. Showers are retreating to the coast tomorrow morning and becoming fine elsewhere. And for Te Kohu, the Chatham Islands, rain is developing tonight, turning to showers tomorrow that are possibly heavy. It's 7 minutes past 5. We'll have news headlines for you at 5:30.
Nā mihi iwi, tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki Checkpoint I tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. All Russian imports to New Zealand will be slapped with a 35% tariff in response to what our foreign minister is describing as abhorrent and reprehensible atrocities committed against Ukrainian citizens. Meanwhile, a US State Department official has told Checkpoint nothing is off the table when it comes to sanctions against Russia, including the possibility of ostracising states or companies who continue to do business with the invaders. More on that shortly, but first, the president of Ukraine's blistering rebuke of the United Nations for its lack of action over Russia's invasion of his country and the litany of war crimes he says followed. Addressing the UN by video link, Volodymyr Zelensky called for Russia, one of 5 permanent members with veto powers, to be expelled from the Security Council to stop it blocking decisions about its own aggression and war. He also challenged the organisation to dissolve itself or reform to be a more effective peacekeeper. President Zelensky's words are translated.
The Russian military and those who gave them orders must be brought to justice immediately for war crimes in Ukraine. Anyone who has given criminal orders and carried out them by killing our people will be brought before the tribunal, which should be similar to the Nuremberg tribunals. Therefore, we must do everything in our power to pass on to the next generation an effective UN with the ability to respond preventively to security challenges and thus guarantee peace, prevent aggression, and force aggressors to peace, have the determination and ability to punish if the principles of peace are violated.
Meanwhile, US President Joe Biden has renewed calls for Vladimir Putin to be tried for war crimes. And America says nothing is off the table in terms of further sanctions against Russia. The US State Department's Director of Eastern European Affairs, John Armstrong, who previously served at the US Embassy in Kiev, warns this will not be a short conflict and says it is truly painful to see what's happening to a peaceful country and its citizens.
These are horrendous crimes, and they're all indications are, as the Secretary of State and the President has said, we condemn these strongly. There is no place for this sort of thing in the modern world, and the perpetrators do need to be held accountable. I mean, it's just personally to me, as someone who's served in Ukraine and the area in Poland and Romania. It also worked on Belarus and Russia. It is just mind-boggling and incredibly saddening that you see crimes now that are similar to what Nazi Germany did during the Second World War, carried out in some of these same areas that suffered under Nazi occupation.
So is it genocide then?
Well, it's, these are horrendous crimes, as both the President and Secretary of State have said. They're certainly war crimes. I mean, it's been stated by more than one that, Putin is a war criminal, that these were clearly taken. There's a pattern of abuse and torture and just outright murder, executions of civilians with their hands tied behind their backs that is more than just isolated incidences and more than isolated units here or there making a decision to just do this. There definitely seems to be a centralized or someone further up giving orders. And these are just horrendous crimes, and we need to follow up and to hold those who carried them out accountable. And also, since they were Russian troops that it appears, or all indications point to, that did this, we need to let the Russian Federation know, the Kremlin, that there's really no place for this, and they need to make sure that it doesn't take place in other parts of occupied Ukraine.
Your president has been very strong on this and says that Mr. Putin needs to stand trial for war crimes, right? So words and condemnation are one thing, but how is that actually going to happen? Who is going to do it?
I think the first step is, of course, to have the will and declare, call things by their proper name, which I think the president has done quite well on. Now, the next step is the execution, and I think one of the things that will have to take place is there'll have to be a careful gathering of evidence, and I know the Ukrainian government has already begun in this area, and we're also supporting efforts to gather evidence, because as in any sort of legal proceeding, especially one of this gravity, you need good, strong evidence. There needs to be a good, strong, exacting case. What the exact venue for such a thing would be, I think that's further down the road, and I have not seen any additional planning on that. But it's definitely the key thing is to call things as they are, by their proper name, and to gather evidence to make sure that when those responsible are held accountable, that justice will truly be done.
Is it time to expel Russia from the UN Security Council?
I know we're moving on. There's talk about the UN Human Rights Commission, and I think that will probably move along. Of course, it's up to the members. We have our position, and we would support that. Getting to the Security Council, that's perhaps something worth considering. But I think we'd have to discuss with our good partners and friends, New Zealand, of course, and New Zealand leads its own foreign policy, and we respect that as a friend of New Zealand. But maybe that's something worth considering. But definitely, I see movement headed in the UN Human Rights Commission, UNHRC.
Let's talk about sanctions. There are multiple significant sanctions against Russia, yet it continues to march on with this war, right? So is the United States considering secondary sanctions, where you sanction states that continue to trade with Russia?
Ms. Owen, that's a good question. I've worked on sanctions with various countries previously when I worked in Russian affairs, and also when I was Belarus desk officer over 20 years ago now. We had various sanctions then on Belarus, and we've continued to place them on. And I think the thing with sanctions is, especially in this case, where if I recall correctly from what our sanctions folks have written, we've had more sanctions put on Russia than in any country ever. I think everything is on the table. Literally everything is on the table. And those who are listening and carefully will understand that in that is the answer to your question.
So secondary sanctions would, in essence, force some countries who are sitting on the fence on this issue to take a side. Do you need that to force Russia to stop?
If secondary sanctions were to happen, and again, I emphasize that everything is on the table. We're in uncharted waters in many ways here, definitely in a new situation. If that would happen, and again, everything is on the table, it would cause for countries and companies to make a choice. As has happened when secondary sanctions have been used in other cases. And it would cause countries to perhaps reconsider where they're at. That, of course, countries have to make their own decisions, but there's clearly a right side and a wrong side in this war. And I would truly hope, and my government would truly hope, that everyone will come down on the right side. Again, the door is open for Russia to stop this. This unprovoked, brutal, unjustifiable war against Ukraine and the Ukrainian people that violates the basic rules of the international order. Russia can stop at any time.
Right now, there is debate over whether Russia is retreating or regrouping, right? What do you think is happening?
Well, Ms. Owen, based on what I'm able to talk about and what's been in open source material and what the Secretary of State has said, we don't see a retreat. We see a regrouping. This is far from over. President Biden was very clear in his remarks that we need to be prepared for a long conflict. This is far from, sadly, this is far from over. Russia could end this brutal, unjustified, unjustifiable, unprovoked war at any time, but we don't see that happening. We see withdrawal, regroup, and preparation for more offensive action in the eastern part of Ukraine, which, don't get me wrong, it's great that Russian forces are moving further away from Kyiv, but the eastern part of Ukraine is also Ukraine. And as President Zelensky has said, he's not going to compromise on Ukraine's territorial integrity or sovereignty, and that's a position that the United States government supports wholeheartedly.
Director, before we go, I just want to circle back to a key issue here, which is the rules-based international order, right? And I'm wondering, how can the world set a benchmark for what is acceptable behaviour when states making the accusations, and I'm including America here, have arguably not upheld the same standards for themselves?
No country is perfect, my own included. I'm a patriot and I love my country, and I'm sure many of your listeners love New Zealand too and are patriotic New Zealanders, which is normal. What we have done in the past, where we haven't always been successful, I think we truly try to. And I do believe in redemption. I truly believe that Russia could turn around and accept the rules-based order. And I think we have been pretty clear on territorial integrity and not supporting war as a way to change one's borders, or just because one covets territory that a neighbor has. We went to war in the for that principle in the Gulf War. We've also certainly World War II. So I think, well, we're not perfect. And please, Ms. Owen, don't tell your listeners I think the United States is perfect. I love my country, but we're not perfect. I think we've done a pretty good job in maintaining it, the rules-based international order, particularly on borders and the sovereignty of borders. And I think we've probably done, in my opinion, we've done better as time has gone on. If I could just add, ma'am, just one other thing. We appreciate what you've done on bringing in your sanctions legislation. That truly shows New Zealand's support and commitment to the people of Ukraine. Dużo wam dziękujemy.
And that was US State Department Director of Eastern European Affairs John Armstrong there, speaking to us from Washington, D.C. It is almost 5:20. Kia mau tonu mai. Stay with us. You are listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Bye-bye, Bloomfield. From August, those 1 p.m. press conferences, if they still exist, won't be the same after the Director-General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, announced he'll step down at the end of July. COVID Response Minister Chris Hipkins has heaped praise on Dr Bloomfield, crediting him with saving thousands of lives. Here's our political reporter, Katie Scotcher.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Kia ora koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to this afternoon's briefing.
After so many greetings, it's time for goodbye. The Director-General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, is stepping down.
Welcome to the first episode of the final season of the Ash and Chippy Show.
It's been a show with countless episodes. In the first 2 months of the COVID-19 pandemic alone, Dr Bloomfield fronted at least 40 press conferences. Calculating how many questions he's been asked since would be a near impossible task.
The weirdest thing about the questions, and this is what the public, I think, points out to me, is when different reporters ask the same question repeatedly and get the same answer. But anyway, that's something I've got used to.
It's not the only thing Dr Bloomfield has gotten used to. The COVID-19 pandemic and the 1 p.m. updates quickly propelled him to NZ celebrity status.
Hello, Aotearoa. I'm Dr Ashley Bloomfield.
There was the Dr Bloomfield merch, including T-shirts and shower curtains, and the shrine in the window of a Wellington shop. His fans showered him with gifts too.
I'm not wearing them today, but early on I did get a very nice pair of tie-dyed Thunder pants, which came as a surprise.
Few civil servants would achieve such recognition.
I thought you've been an inspiring man.
I think he's done an awesome job for the country. Just the way he is plain speaking and just the way he's dealt with the whole pandemic.
I think he's extremely hard-working by the look of it. At least he looks really run down half the time.
I've always been impressed that he's been involved in the science of it rather than the politics of it, and I thought that was actually what New Zealand needed.
But the fame and the responsibility of leading the country's COVID-19 health response has taken a toll. Dr Bloomfield says the stress and pressure of the job factored into his decision to step down. He's been thinking about doing so for some time.
It's a complex and challenging role at any time. And the last 2 years, I don't think, could have been more complex and challenging.
Dr Bloomfield leaves at the end of July and plans to take an extended break.
Some time out to sort of just really let go of something that is the pandemic is something you carry with you 24/7, even when you're on holiday. So that's the first thing. And I'm putting some thought into what I do next. I guess I could say I'm a public servant through and through, so that will be steering what my next steps are.
There is one career path he has ruled out. Dr Bloomfield was asked if he'd consider running for Parliament.
Not a jot.
Those already elected to Parliament reflecting on Dr Bloomfield's work.
I cannot imagine someone who is a better example of what being a true public servant is.
One of the coolest Director-Generals to have to be in front of us every day almost for the past 2 years.
Over the last couple of years, the hours he would have put in would have been extraordinary, incredibly challenging
role.
Dr. Bloomfield, during your time as Director General of Health, you have saved thousands, if not tens of thousands, of lives.
Not everyone, however, is sad to see Dr. Bloomfield go. Here's ACT leader David Seymour.
He's not saying to Ashley, if you consider the failings of the department he was responsible for, which are considerable.
An acting Director General will be appointed soon, as will Dr. Caroline McElnay's replacement. The Director of Public Health, who played a major role in the pandemic response, has also resigned. Their replacements have big shoes to fill and a big job ahead. The pandemic is far from over, and the government's major health reforms take effect just weeks before Dr. Bloomfield leaves.
An Auckland University epidemiologist wants pharmacies to be doing RATs to improve the accuracy of tests and better capture the results. There are increasing reports of people having the virus but recording negative RATs, sometimes multiple times. Our reporter Robin Martin has more.
Christchurch furniture restorer Lucy caught COVID at a wedding.
The classic super spreader, and 70 of the 92 guests caught it. And so all my friends, I guess we all heard on the Sunday that someone had tested positive, and we all started going down pretty much the same day. But all my friends had tested positive on the rat tests at home, and I hadn't.
After returning 2 negative rats, Lucy took things into her own hands and went to get a PCR.
I did one on the Monday, one on the Tuesday, and by that Tuesday all my friends had tested positive. And then I just went to get a test on the Wednesday morning, a PCR test, and then got that positive result on the Thursday morning.
Lucy's experience doesn't surprise Professor Rod Jackson.
Depending on who does the test, if it's done at home, it might miss up to 50% of positives. If it's done by someone who's skilled, you might get up to 80% plus.
Professor Jackson says in the middle of an Omicron outbreak, there's no alternative to rats because PCR testing would be overwhelmed. But he reckons rapid antigen testing could be improved.
Could we actually train every pharmacist in the country, perhaps, and make them widely available in places where someone trained takes the swab, does the test and records it?
Professor Jackson says businesses relying on self-testing to allow staff back to work are putting themselves at risk because rats are not dependable. Most people spoken to by RNZ at the Northcote Clinic in North Auckland had a good experience using rats.
But so far, I tested my daughter positive, so that's okay.
Yeah, we've got them for the family. Every time everyone has a sniffle, they get out and they're fine. Yeah, cool. So we haven't had COVID yet. But
I took the wrong one, so I'm coming back again this second time. I missed my flight yesterday.
Oh no!
Oh, the information is not good enough.
My son had COVID, and so the rats were great.
COVID Response Minister Chris Hipkins says the government knew when the country moved to rats there would be more cases that slipped through the gaps. But he says that's why there are other public health measures in place.
We're asking household contacts to stay home for a period of time for a reason. We're asking people to monitor for symptoms and stay home if they are unwell for a reason. We're asking people to wear masks. We're asking people to wash their hands and do the social distancing and do all of those public health measures because there is nothing here that's 100% foolproof.
The Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, says the rats are not as sensitive and that's why they have not been rolled out earlier.
In a low prevalence situation, which New Zealand was in for the best part of 2 years, 9 out of 10 positive tests would have actually been false positives. And now we find, of course, and you'll all know people who have been clearly symptomatic, they're clearly close contacts, but have had repeated negative tests and then return a positive rapid antigen test or a positive PCR eventually.
The Ministry of Health says there are step-by-step instructions on how to take rats on the ministry website. It says people who have COVID symptoms or are feeling unwell after returning a negative rat should stay home and contact their health provider or call Healthline.
We'd love to hear from you. Homai o whakaaro. Send us your feedback. Nō reira anei na kaupapa mo te hōtaka nei. What confidence do you have in the RAT tests? If you've been using them, what's your experience? Also, let us know your thoughts on the departure of Dr. Bloomfield and what more we can do to stop Russia's war on Ukraine. Text me, pātui mai, 2101. Tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Tiger Woods has the sports world purring with anticipation. The golf superstar is set to make yet another improbable comeback when the famed Masters tournament tees off on Friday. The return comes little more than a year since a serious car crash left him bedbound for 3 months. And as Clay Wilson reports, the 5-time Masters champion hasn't come back just to take part.
You've said countless times throughout your career that you don't enter a golf tournament unless you think that you can win it. So the question is simple. Do you think you can win the Masters this week?
I do.
2 words. It's all Tiger Woods needed to send the sports world into a spin ahead of the 86th edition of the Masters. Just 14 months ago, doctors considered amputating his right leg after he crashed an SUV at an estimated 120 kilometres per hour. Woods spent 3 months in a hospital bed, and as early as 2 months ago, the 46-year-old said he had a long way to go in his recovery. But for someone who's endured at least 10 surgeries to his back and legs, defying the odds is nothing new.
As of right now, I feel like I am going to play. I'm going to play 9 more holes tomorrow. My recovery has been good. My team has been fantastic, and so we've got another day of 9 more holes and then come game time.
It hasn't been hard to see the sheer magnitude of Woods' presence at Augusta, with hordes of fans following his every move over the last 3 days. He even compared his practice round to the final round of his 15th major triumph at the same venue in 2019.
It felt a little bit like that, not quite as frenzied as that was. That was a little bit different. I was on a championship Sunday, but yesterday was incredible.
Justin Thomas, one of Woods' closest friends on tour, played alongside the superstar in that practice round and was staggered by what he saw.
It was unbelievable. It's probably more people that's ever watched me play around at Augusta National, and they weren't watching me. So being able to feed off that energy, use the adrenaline, it's definitely going to be helpful.
Spaniard John Rahm, favourite to win his first major, agrees the buzz around Augusta National is undeniable.
You can feel it. A lot of it is Tiger, because there's a lot more electricity in the air in that sense. And Monday felt like a Saturday in a regular event.
With the latest comeback all but confirmed, only one thing remains unanswered. And 4-time major winner Rory McIlroy is confident Woods can be a contender.
The golf is there. He's hitting it well, he's chipping well, he's sharp. It's just the physical demand of getting around 72 holes here this week. That's probably the question mark, but would I be surprised? No, I'm not surprised at anything he does anymore.
You get the feeling the man himself isn't either. Woods' body may not be the same, but that trademark confidence is firmly intact despite the hurdles in his way.
I can hit it just fine. Walking is the hard part. This is normally not an easy walk to begin with. Now, given the conditions that my leg is in, it gets a little bit more difficult. And it's going to be a tough challenge, and a challenge that I'm up for.
Woods is scheduled to tee off his opening round in the early hours of Friday morning, New Zealand time.
And that was Clay Wilson reporting. Kia ora, e te iwi e Hariaki nei e a Checkpoint. Resource consents for some Airbnbs, bureaucratic overkill or regulation of an industry that is changing neighbourhoods. Small-time housing developers could take a hit as prices slump. And apparently we don't like to move it. Since COVID, exercise rates have dropped since the first lockdown and we haven't bounced back since. So how do we get moving again? Homai o whakaaro, we would love your feedback. You can text us 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time for the headlines now. Anei a iwi mina bitbita kōrero.
The Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, is confident processes are in place to respond to the COVID pandemic after he leaves in July. In another unexpected move today, the Health Ministry has confirmed that the Director of Public Health, Caroline McElnay, is stepping down, and her Deputy Director of Public Health, Nikki Stefanogiannis, is departing. New Zealand is being thanked for slapping more sanctions on Russia. In the latest round of measures to punish Russia for invading Ukraine, all products imported into New Zealand from Russia will face a 35% tariff. US Department of State Director of the Eastern European Division, John Armstrong, says it will contribute to the international pressure on Russia. High winds are preventing firefighters from tackling the large blaze on a conservation wetland near Bluff. More than 1,300 hectares of vegetation at Awaroa has been destroyed. Ground and air crews had to stop working this morning because of the unfavourable weather. Between 30 and 40 firefighters and 6 aircraft will be at the site tomorrow. Researchers are warning that returning to work too soon after recovering from COVID-19 can tip people into long COVID symptoms. Te Wanaka Senior Research Fellow, Dr. Mona Jeffries, believes financial and social pressures are forcing people to return to work before they've fully recovered from the virus. She says the week of isolation is by no means a reflection of recovery time. There are 12,575 new community cases of COVID-19 today, 1,500 fewer than yesterday. 15 deaths have been recorded. And the landmark domes and antennae at the controversial Waihopai station near Blenheim are being removed. Protests have been held at the site for decades, with claims it was a spy base. The Government Communications Security Bureau says the technology at the station is now virtually obsolete. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 6.
Thanks, Evie. No mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. It is time for the business news. Ko taku hoa and nei ko Nona Peltier. Nona, efforts underway to support more women entrepreneurs. What's going on?
Yeah, this is a fund that's been set up by the Icehouse Ventures. It's called the Archangels Fund 2. It follows a fund that was set up, I guess a couple of years ago. It assisted 31 startups led by women, and that fund raised $2.8 million. This time around, the fund is looking to raise $20 million and help 50 women in their startup ventures. One of the reasons why this is specifically for women is that they tend to struggle to raise funds compared with ventures set up by men. And so we've talked a lot about gender pay gaps and so on. There's a gap also in terms of funding. So this particular fund is for women only, but it's also supported by men. Some 40% of the investors are men. And the fund has so far raised, $5 million, and it's looking to raise the rest. They're saying here that there's no reason why New Zealand women can't build billion-dollar global industries just like men do.
Too true, Nona. Now, the ANZ World Commodity Price Index hit a new record in March. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is a good one. This is a bit of a good news story for people working out in the farms and other places. For example, the New Zealand, commodity prices, that's dairy and aluminium prices, helped bring our exports way up. A rise of 3.9% last month, an 18% increase over the year earlier. And part of that is a 7.6% rise in dairy prices. And that's despite some volatility that we've seen recently. The other one that's really interesting is aluminium. The largest producer of aluminium in the world is Russia. And because of sanctions, Russia's not able to necessarily supply the raw material, or rather get it either. And as a result of that, the prices have been rising, and New Zealand, of course, is a big exporter of aluminium. Other big gains are in forestry and wood products. Unfortunately, depending on which side of the fence you're on, the strengthening New Zealand dollar has been denting the return to exporters. We have dropped against our main trading partners. We've risen against our main trading partners. And so instead of having a nice big gain, we have a slightly less gain.
And shall we take a wee jog around the markets, Nona?
Yes, well, just talking about that strong New Zealand dollar, it's trading at 69.4 US cents, 91.6 Australian and 53.1 British pence. And the local top 50 index, it closed down 0.33% today. That was a 42-point drop to 12,079. And that's what we're seeing really in Asia as well. Investors are a bit worried about some aggressive monetary tightening by the US Federal Reserve as they're going to fight inflation. And of course, the sanctions that are going on there with Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Thanks, Nona. Nona Peltier with Business News there. Restrictive and outdated, that's Airbnb's assessment of new rules coming from Christchurch City Council. Some short-term accommodation providers are being made to apply for resource consent. The council says the move will regulate the industry and acknowledge the impact visitors have on neighbourhoods. Tessa Guest reports.
Airbnb host Norm Hartwell has hosted people in his 4-bedroom Riccarton house most nights for the last 3 years, apart from during lockdowns. He enjoys it and says it's given him something to do since his wife died. But while he's a dedicated host, he says the council's new rules will discourage others and ultimately result in less accommodation options in the city.
Not every Airbnb host is dedicated, and so they will probably just quit. It'll be a silent vote with their feet.
Under the new rules, operators renting out fewer than 60 unhosted nights a year for a maximum of 6 guests will have to apply for resource consent, although the council cannot decline the application, only add conditions. Hosts with between 6 and 12 guests for more than 60 unhosted nights could be turned down. Mr. Hartwell says they're being unfairly targeted.
They had some very funny ideas, like Airbnb should only operate for 60 or 90 days per year, which, if it was a hot dog stand, that's absurd, asking a business to only operate for a quarter of the year.
But City Councillor Mike Davidson says council always required resource consent, but operators have been flouting the rules. Now, council's made the process clearer and easier.
The reality is, you're operating a business from your home. You should be following other rules that other businesses have to follow as well.
Mr. Davidson says the restrictions will level the playing field for traditional accommodation providers hit by the rising popularity in home share platforms as well as the pandemic.
I think these new rule changes are quite timely, and the fact that the border's about to open up, it's actually good to actually put some good rules in place that actually will enable home share accommodation, but actually also put some rules that will help mitigate the impact on community as well.
Christchurch City Hotel Manager Sui Te says the changes have been a long time coming for the industry. He's lost regular guests to Airbnb and has been frustrated by the lack of regulation.
They have very little overheads because they just could be a papa mama business. They just go and clean it themselves. They have no health and safety framework within their place. They just advertise a house and that's all they do.
Airbnb has objected to the council's decision, saying they are the most restrictive and outdated home sharing rules in Australasia.
Let's get to some of your feedback now on Ukraine. John's got in touch to say it's fine to put 35% tariffs on Russian imports, but how about the government donating the extra money collected to Ukraine? Another listener says, how can India be in the new Asian alliances but not condemn an unprovoked invasion into Ukraine? Can you get someone on to explain? And just on that point, if the United States brings in secondary sanctions, it would force countries like India to take a side, to choose and state their position publicly. And another person says on Russia, they have committed atrocities, but so have the US many, many times, along with Australia and the UK. Rat tests and their accuracy. Regarding rat tests, when they are so unreliable, why are they so expensive at the chemist? One listener says. Peter's got in touch, a pharmacist, who says, as a pharmacist who has administers hundreds of rat tests, the key is the technique. Low and slow. Unfortunately, most people don't take the swab correctly. Ngā mihi, Peter. Thanks for getting in touch, Peter. On Dr. Bloomfield, arise, Sir Bloomfield, the words I long to hear, this listener says. Another person says, thank you, Dr. Bloomfield, you're awesome. All the best for your unselfish future. Steve, on the other hand, says, thank goodness Bloomfield is going. Just wish he would take the Adern with him. Keep your feedback coming. Text us on 2101 or tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. Small-time developers or builders trying to make a buck will most likely be the ones left in the lurch as house prices look to be cooling. Data from CoreLogic shows while year-on-year growth remains hot at more than 23%, prices are slowing and in some cities contracting month on month. So with a shift to a buyer's market, who might be left in the cold? Emma Hatton reports.
Sellers have had the upper hand for years, with house prices reaching new records each month and buyers increasingly left to battle it out for top dollar across the floor of the auction room. But early signals are that the tables are turning. Last month saw house price growth at its lowest point in 19 months, with prices month on month in some cities, including Wellington, Hamilton and Dunedin, in reverse. Auckland mortgage broker Bruce Patton says anyone who bought in the last couple of years with the hopes of flipping for profit might be in for a rude awakening.
And a lot of those ones, unfortunately, will end up being, your small developers or your builder that gets together with his brother and parents and think they can be developers and buy some land and do some stuff. I think it's those people that are going to come unstuck.
He says this group differs from people who bought with the intention of living in the home, who might see they overpaid, but had no intention of selling anytime soon anyway.
The only people that will lose money in this current market are people that have to sell. If you don't have to sell and you can ride out whatever the next 1-2 years brings, what we always get off the back of a slow or a declining market is another boom.
So with that in mind, he urges homeowners to ride things out. However, he says while recent buyers were stress tested to make home loan repayments on higher interest rates, in the 6 to 7% range, there's no doubt the next few years will be tough for some.
If you've borrowed $1 million, your interest cost was $25,000 a year, it's now going to be $50,000. That's genuinely going to hurt some people. Young people I'm not so worried about because they're at the beginning of their work life and they genuinely tend to have income increases on a regular basis.
Professional renovator and property developer Tom Fay says those who recently purchased properties with the intention of flipping might find themselves refinancing or selling for less.
That's the one that's going to catch people out. So if those kind of people tend to work with a short-term lender, so the short-term lender might give you a 6, 8 or 12-month loan. Now, if you were expecting to turn that property around within that period, you're going to start feeling the pinch.
He says supply chain delays and workers being off-site with COVID is also costing anyone in the business. However, even with the cooling, plenty of opportunities remain. He says speculators just need to be smart.
So the creams come off the top. So what that means is that we can now, you, myself, and anybody else listening, can go into really great neighborhoods anywhere in the country and buy ourselves a do-up opportunity that's going to be lower. There's fewer buyers. You'll be the only horse in the race. And that's the kind of purchase that you want to be making.
Meanwhile, Auckland University Associate Professor of Economics Ryan Greenaway-McGreevy is warning while there's no doubt house prices have become unsustainable, weaning the economy off of them will be painful. He says the adjustment will likely include rising unemployment and a slower increase in wages.
Let's return to the Ukraine now, where those on the front line have suffered devastating injuries. Many are civilians, engineers, lawyers and civil servants turned soldiers. CNN's Ivan Watson gained exclusive access to a military hospital in eastern Ukraine. Its exact location can't be identified for fears it will be targeted by Russian forces. And just a warning, if you are watching, some of the images are graphic and disturbing.
Shattered bodies in the intensive care unit of a Ukrainian hospital. Men and women from the Ukrainian military whose war wounds are so catastrophic they need machines to breathe. These deeply uncomfortable images, a glimpse of the physical toll this conflict is taking on both soldiers and civilians. The general director of the hospital says that after the first couple of days of this new war, at least 30 medical personnel resigned because of just the trauma of seeing these kinds of injuries up close. A soldier named Yuri wants to communicate. He can't speak because he's still on a ventilator. He has regained consciousness after 11 days in a coma. We won't identify him because doctors say his family does not yet know of his injuries. He has one child, Malchik. A daughter, he signals, 13 years old. Writing in my notebook, Yuri tells me he's been in the military for 2 years. The doctors say that he has a very good chance of surviving very serious shrapnel injuries to his body. We were given permission to film here, provided we not name the hospital nor the city that we're in. And that's because the Ukrainian authorities fear that that information could lead to the Russian military directly targeting this hospital. In every room here, there's a patient whose bones and tissues have been ripped apart by flying metal. Vladimir is a volunteer. He signed up on the second day of this war in 2022. This electrician turned volunteer soldier comes from the Russian-speaking city of Kharkiv. 3 days ago, a battle left him with 2 broken arms and wounds to the stomach. Vladimir says his sister lives in Russia and he no longer communicates with her. I asked why. He said that she believes that the Ukrainians are enemies. This is a family that is split apart by this war and different narratives of who started it. Vladimir and the soldier with a fresh amputation lying next to him both insist that only force can stop Russia's war on this country. Down the hall, I meet a young civilian, also horrifically wounded.
21.
21. Dima is 21 years old. Where are you from?
Mariupol.
Dima is a recent university graduate, photographed here with his mother, Natasha.
Mama pogibla.
My mother died when this happened to me, he says, adding, I've cried it off already. I'm calmer now. He says on the night of March 9th, he and his mother were hiding in the bathroom of a 2-story house in the center of Mariupol when they heard warplanes overhead bombing the neighborhood. Mother and son were hiding in the bathroom shortly before 1 a.m., he says, when the bomb hit the house. When he woke up, his legs were gone. He never saw his mother again. During my visit, a friend gives Dima a phone. This is the first time he's seeing the building where he and his mother were sheltering when they were hit.
Машина моей матери.
The red car here that is destroyed in front of the ruined building was his mother's car.
Of course I get angry. I get sad. I get depressed at times, but I can't lose my cool, because those who did this to me, they probably want me to sit here crying and weeping.
Don't let the silence in these halls fool you. There is deep, seething anger in this hospital at the country that launched this unprovoked war on Ukraine.
Back home now, the lifeblood is draining out of Lake Wanaka. We're talking water here. The lake is approaching its lowest level in almost 30 years, threatening marine life and worrying local farmers after what has been described as a summer of climate extremes. Wanaka freshwater ecologist Chris Arbuckle joins us now. Tēnā koe, Chris. Can you hear me, Chris?
Yeah, I can. How are you going?
I'm very well, thanks. Hey, just in terms of the lake, I imagine you've been past recently. It must be pretty upsetting for someone like you to see it how it is.
Yeah, I'm actually sat within about sort of 80 metres of it at the moment. I live quite close to it. And I suppose like all the locals down here that love the lake, we've just noticed a few things happening probably faster and more extreme than we have done over the years we've lived here. So that's what I was talking about.
Yeah, what have you noticed?
I suppose the last 3 months we've had sort of droughts and then an extreme flood and then a drought. And for the creatures I've studied in my past life as a scientist, it's pretty hard work for them. I suppose they're struggling to particularly respond to these, what I suppose is climatic changes. And what that means for our lake is essentially some of the values, the things that we love, are at threat. And I suppose it's a reality we're facing with climate change.
What creatures are you talking about there?
So I've done a lot of work studying native fish. So they're the creatures that actually make up your whitebait patty, actually, around here. So the galaxids, they're the bling of our streams. And they exist and may eke out a living in some of our tributaries that feed the lake. And those tributaries have been drying up probably faster and at a more extreme rate than I've seen them over my sort of 50-odd years of kind of coming up here and playing in the water.
So tell me, Chris, what does it look like at the moment, and how does that compare to what it would usually look like at the moment?
Yeah, that's a golden question, I suppose. So I've been alive for 10,000 odd years. So I suppose from my perspective, it was about 30 odd years ago in the early 90s when the lake got this low so fast. And I suppose that's the thing. We're just seeing suddenly things happen very quickly. So in January, the lake got very low, and then we received pretty much our monthly rainfall in 36 hours. And then again in March, again we've seen the lake get very low again. So I suppose that's the thing. We're just, for me personally, I'm wondering how these organisms will sort of respond in the future. These really sort of fast, dramatic changes.
Yeah, so what happens, do you know, when there is the inevitable downpour that comes after this big dry?
Yeah, well, again, the creatures have been sort of forced out into some of the major rivers, and part of the work that I've done in the past with more intelligent people than me is around disturbance theory. So simply that's how ecosystems respond to major perturbations. So if you think about that from a human perspective, and we've dealt with it ourselves in New Zealand, where a community gets hit by something like an earthquake, it's much the same sort of effect for ecosystems. They have to figure out a way to respond. So what that means is they go and find new places to live, and sometimes not the best place. And for a native fish, that means they'll go out into major rivers, and we have predators like trout that are introduced, and they feed on them, so they have nowhere to go. And that's the thing, where we tend to see that the numbers of fish reduce through time.
And what is this all meaning for recreation? You mentioned the whitebait, fritters and paddies. So, and also for just swimming or using the lake?
Yeah, I have some very close friends that are swimmers in the lake, and they themselves were saying, look, we're seeing far more sort of real estate in the form of exposed beaches and rocks, and I suppose the environment of swimming has changed. Probably what that means is it just raises your awareness of what's changing, and it gives you a point in time where you think, well, what is it going to look like in the future? And at times, too, that can affect their values, particularly around things like water quality, and I suppose the value of swimming around an area in the lake, which generally previously you're sort of swimming in sort of 10 metres of water, and now it's down to a couple of metres.
So has that revealed anything helpful, the low water level?
From the point of view of helpful, not sure if there's anything I'd put helpful in it. I suppose what it does, it raises people's awareness. And I think that's one good thing about things that look a bit odd, is people start thinking about the world that they're in. Particularly for me, and some people I know that really do a lot of work on the lake. They're going, well, how can we help the species that live in it? What can we do in the future to kind of make sure that we help them exist? And that may mean things like doing fish relocations or actually thinking ahead of time with regards to what species need for management of water. So I suppose that's where it helps, yeah.
Those are big questions, aren't they, Chris, to find answers to?
Yeah, and I've been at this game for a long time, and I wouldn't say I've got any answers. It's more of a case of, I think, individuals and their love of water is a key thing about it. And there's little things that you do count. Some of those bigger questions don't get answered until you get off your bus and actually do something about it. So, yeah.
So a dry, shrinking lake is the equivalent of a giant warning billboard for us?
Possibly, though oddly in my career, whenever I've muttered about drought, it's rained. So last night we got about 60 to 100 mils on the main divide. That put a bit of water back into the lake. So I wouldn't say it's fixed the problem, but it's just the things that happen in the background. It's good to see a bit more water flowing around, a bit more water on the landscape, particularly for the farming community around here.
Thank you for joining us, Chris. That's Chris Arbuckle, who's a Wanaka freshwater ecologist. Post-viral brain fog is causing forgetfulness, fuzziness and fatigue for New Zealanders trying to return to work after COVID. The Royal College of GPs says most symptoms should resolve within 4 to 6 weeks, but long COVID is diagnosed when symptoms last more than 12 weeks. Sam Ollie spoke to recovering cases fighting the fog.
When Hammer McNeil caught COVID, his blocked up nose and sore throat went away quickly, but not the mental fatigue. When he tried to go back to work, he needed to nap multiple times a day. He was forgetting work colleagues' names, not recalling details. His confidence dropped. He worried he'd lose his job.
I seriously thought at one point, this is it. This is the next 5 years of my life. Could this be the new me?
The 38-year-old father went to see his GP about his post-COVID brain fog that lasted a month. Looking back, his concentration was so bad, he says he shouldn't have been on the road. He crashed his motorbike just 30 metres from the clinic on his way home.
Lost a lot of skin and a lot of bruising and some lacerations. I'm really lucky. It could have been a lot worse. Probably because I was foggy, I was going slower. So maybe that was a bit of a help there.
Emeritus Professor Warren Tate from the University of Otago is constantly hearing from people worried their lingering COVID symptoms will become long COVID.
I'm now getting every day several emails and phone calls from people, desperate, asking me what can they do?
But with such a new virus and evolving variants, he can't give definitive answers.
It's very scary and very hard to predict, and all I can say is just almost being sensible, not trying to push yourself back into a normal life again, stresses of work, and trying to keep the stress levels down.
Royal College of GPs Medical Director Dr Brian Betty says most symptoms stop within 6 weeks, but there's not much GPs can do.
There doesn't seem to be any specific treatment apart from just resting, taking it easy, plenty of fluids, eating well, and just building your exercise tolerance over time. And in the majority of cases, these type of symptoms do actually go.
This Otago University student in her early 20s caught COVID in O week in mid-February, but her concentration isn't 100% yet, and she still has frequent headaches. She's considered dropping out.
My memory's gotten really bad. More like long-term memory. Short-term memory seems fine. But like if someone were to ask me, oh, did we do this a couple of weeks ago? I would literally be like, I'm sorry, I don't know. I can't remember. And my mood really low. I had to start taking antidepressants again.
27-year-old Aucklander Anna Thomas tested positive 2.5 weeks ago and has returned to work. She's finding computer work, writing emails, much harder than before.
And even when I'm speaking, I speak to large groups. I often can't form sentences properly, and I sort of had to stop myself and think about what I'm saying again. So, yeah, it feels slow and sort of like I'm sort of, even now, I'm not sure like the next word to say.
Te Herenga Waka Senior Research Fellow Dr Mona Jeffries is worried COVID-infected people feel too much financial and social pressure to return to work before their brain function is restored.
We know the isolation period has been defined according to when you stop being infectious, but that in no way reflects necessarily impacts on your body and your abilities to get back to normal life.
Dr Mona Jeffries is in a team of researchers surveying people infected in 2020 and 2021 about their long-term recoveries. She hopes the government will extend sick leave and provide disability support for people with long COVID.
RNZ News at 6. Good evening, kia ora tātou. I'm Evie Ashton. Today's been marked by news of the departure of 3 of New Zealand's top health officials, including Director General Ashley Bloomfield. The Director of Public Health, Caroline McElnay, and her deputy, Nikki Stefanogiannis, have also stepped down.
The pandemic's made Dr Bloomfield a household name, leading the COVID response, including numerous appearances at the 1:00 briefings. He cited the stress of the job and the wish to spend more time with his family, stepping down roughly a year before his full 5-year term. While there have been criticisms through the pandemic, National says today isn't about that, but rather time to reflect on his service and wish him well. Government ministers had high praise for his work through extremely challenging times and his contribution to the COVID response. Dr McElnay was also a regular at the COVID briefings and steps down from Monday.
A leaked memo from Auckland health officials raises more questions about the accuracy of rapid antigen tests. The document from the Northern Region Health Coordination Centre was obtained by a local democracy reporter. It was sent to health providers in the region on March the 26th. The memo says the Health Ministry has told the centre that in the last month it distributed 50 million tests into the system, and so far fewer than 1 million results have been reported. It goes on to mention the increased number of false positives and negatives and the need to shift towards more PCR testing immediately. The US believes Russia's invasion of Ukraine could be drawn out, with a top official saying the war is far from over. After weeks of resistance, Russian forces have moved away from the capital, Kyiv. But US Department of State Director of the Eastern European Division, John Armstrong, has told Checkpoint that may mean there is worse fighting to come.
We don't see a retreat. We see a regrouping. This is far from over. President Biden was very clear in his remarks that we need to be prepared for a long conflict. This is far from, sadly, this is far from over. Russia could end this brutal, unjustified, unjustifiable, unprovoked war at any time. but we don't see that happening.
New Zealand is imposing a 35% tariff on all Russian imports. A mortgage broker says people who bought property in the last couple of years hoping to flip it for a profit might be in for a rude awakening. House price data for March shows while year-on-year growth remains strong at more than 23%, prices are slowing and in some cities contracting compared to February. Bruce Patton from Loan Market says some investors will get caught short.
And a lot of those ones, unfortunately, will end up being, your small developers or your builder that gets together with his brother and parents and think they can be developers and buy some land and do some stuff. I think it's those people that are going to come unstuck.
Bruce Patton says rising interest rates for highly leveraged homeowners will also make for a tough few years. Police are tracking down a person who assaulted a council worker in Levin this morning. The council officer was injured in the incident at the Civic Building on Levin's main street. Rosie Gordon reports.
Horowhenua District Mayor Bernie Wandin says a person managed to get into the foyer after 8 o'clock this morning before the building opened at 9. He says matters quickly escalated between the person and one of 3 staff present, resulting in an unprovoked assault. The council worker did not require hospital treatment, and police say inquiries to find the alleged offender are ongoing. Mr Wandin says the incident was captured on CCTV and he hopes an arrest will be made soon. The Oxford Street building was closed today after the attack.
Windy and unfavourable weather conditions have put efforts to fight a large fire south of Invercargill on hold. The fire at Awadua has burnt through more than 1,300 hectares of conservation wetlands. Strong winds have grounded helicopters and firefighters stopped activity around 10 o'clock this morning. Fire and Emergencies Mark Mawini says a few hotspots remain with no visible flames. He says thermal imaging drones will be used once conditions ease. Mr Mawini says there'll be 30 to 40 firefighters and 6 aircraft working on the fire tomorrow. And a main highway into Palmerston North will no longer be lined with brightly coloured planter boxes. The boxes acted as a barrier between bikes and vehicles on a 1.5 kilometre trial cycleway along Main Street, but were unpopular with residents. At a council meeting, Mayor Grant Smith's motion to immediately replace them with a different type of barrier passed 13 votes to 2. He says councillors have to listen to the overwhelming public feedback against the boxes. Councillors voted unanimously to make the separated cycleway permanent. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, getting your garden ready for winter with Amy Kennedy and Lily White from the Germinate Collective. Deborah Challonor's Vietnam War novel, The Leonard Girls, is this week's Hump Prize. And Nicholas Flamant on the emerging science of what lies underneath the tectonic plates. Blobs, apparently. I might have to come up with something slightly more catchy. On Nights of me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
You're back on Checkpoint with Lisa Owen next. First, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Thursday. Northland to Kapiti Coast, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and the Central High Country. Partly cloudy with a few showers, possibly thundery about the Eastern Bay of Plenty ranges today. Clearing and becoming fine tomorrow. From Gisborne to Wairarapa and Wellington, mostly fine. A few showers spreading from the south this evening, clearing in Wellington and Wairarapa tomorrow afternoon. For inland Marlborough, also Nelson, Buller and Westland. Rain is clearing Buller this afternoon, otherwise isolated showers are clearing tomorrow morning. Coastal Marlborough and Canterbury, mostly cloudy with a few showers, becoming fine tomorrow afternoon. Occasional showers are forecast for Otago, Southland and Fiordland. Thunderstorms and gale southwesterlies are possible about the coast until the evening. Showers are retreating to the coast tomorrow morning and becoming fine elsewhere. And for Te Kohu, the Chatham Islands, rain is developing tonight, turning to showers tomorrow that are possibly heavy. It's 6 minutes past 6. We'll have news headlines for you at 6:30.
Kia ora rā e ho, no mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. COVID's turned us into a bunch of couch potatoes. A Sport New Zealand study shows post the 2020 lockdown, participation in weekly physical activity was down almost 6% on pre-pandemic levels, and things, well, they went downhill from there. The time spent exercising each week dropped 15% on what it was before COVID, and the number of adults not meeting the recommended weekly levels of physical activity slid 5% below pre-pandemic levels. Well, joining us now is Richard Betty from Exercise New Zealand. So, Richard, when we think of ourselves as a sporting country, is that complete bull?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't be how I'd describe it, but I'd say I think we're not a sporting country, we're a sport-watching country. Because if we think about the big sports that we like to think of ourselves, like rugby, even America's Cup, that does not translate into more people playing rugby or more people yachting, actually. And again, I love watching both of those teams, but that doesn't make me active by watching them. And I think we've got to be really careful here when we talk about sport. A very limited number of people play it. And in fact, sport is on the decline, and this report is really just reconfirming that. Whereas physical activity, actually, broadly speaking, prior to COVID, is on the increase because physical activity has a different space, which is do it on your terms. If you want to do it at lunchtime, we'll put a class on at lunchtime. If it's skateboarding for kids, then we'll build the skateboarding park. Whatever the activity is sort of more driven by the consumer than it is by the sport. And I'm not knocking sport here. Sport has its place to play, as does cycling to work. But really, recreational activities are the future that we need to really focus on because they are the things that provide choices to the consumer on their terms, whether it be a yoga class or a boot camp or a gym activity. They're all things that people can do when they choose to do them.
Well, Richard, then that's the thing that perplexes me, right? Because during lockdown, we arguably had the most freedom to exercise in the sense that there was virtually no place that we could go other than around the neighbourhood for a walk or a cycle, yet by all accounts, we couldn't be bothered.
Yeah, so it was very clear to say during lockdown there was very much a tweak and a boost in particular activities. So walking was one of them. I think we all know we went for a walk and we saw neighbours we'd never met before. And the other thing that was great was we saw families walking together, and quite often from necessity because if mum or dad goes outside, they have to bring the kids with them. And so there was actually a positive, but the problem was it didn't last. And the other thing was it was supplementing or replacing the activities that people would actually normally do. There was some positive because some people experienced it who weren't normally active, but unfortunately it didn't translate into ongoing activity. And the problem was, in fact, the statistics which showed that, we've still got a 5% drop that is not meeting the guidelines. We started from an incredibly low base. We are 13th worst in the world for physical inactivity. And most people think, so US is number 1 and Australia is number 2. Not at all. We are the top Western country in the world for physical inactivity. And that's why I keep on saying we are not a sporting nation, we're a sport-watching nation. And what we need to really focus on, in fact, the authors here urge the government to take urgent action on this. This is something that we've had prior to COVID, and I think we've had this fixation with COVID from public health officials, and I think COVID's important. It's not the only issue, because if we focus just on COVID, we're going to blow the health budget from physical inactivity costs. We won't be able to afford healthcare.
Richard, do you think we've been frightened into staying at home?
I think there has been a whole range of things that have happened. And if you take Auckland was a unique case because literally we closed certain things and we had high-profile public health officials saying gyms are unsafe, don't go to them. And quite simply, it's not backed by the science. I'd be happy to publicly debate any of those people who say that because I've got really great evidence that shows that is not the case from British medical journals all the way through to really good data from other countries that shows that physical activity is part of the solution. It is not the problem. Now, with COVID, we still need to be mindful. We're having controls, whether it's wearing masks or distancing. But to just close something that provides a public health benefit is so narrow-minded because it's looking at whether you get COVID today, but it's not looking at the hundreds of millions of dollars. I've done a back of the envelope calculation. The cost of that 5% is $130 million annually on extra health burden from today.
Right. Richard, you're talking about, diabetes, heart attack, whatever, in terms of a health condition versus COVID, the comparison. Another thing I'm interested in is often it's said that cost is a barrier for participation. Is that right, or are we just simply lazy?
Well, I'd characterise it this way. I think cost is a barrier for some people for some activities, but there are activities that are free. Going for a walk is a form of physical activity, as I say, going for a bike ride. I realise you've got to buy a bike for that, but there are definitely free activities. And in fact, even if you look at, say, a gym or a yoga space, many yoga classes or yoga studios will have a karma, a koha class, I should say, on the weekends, which is like a donation only to give back to the community. So there are things around if you look for them. So I'd never accuse anyone of being lazy, but I would say look for the opportunities. If price is the barrier, then look for those opportunities that might be either free or low cost. If it's not the barrier, then sometimes by paying money, you can actually get some support from whether it's a gym or a personal trainer to help you on your journey. But for a small group of people, price can be a barrier, but there are activities that are free and many provided by councils at really low cost.
I'm interested in the whole lockdown scenario. So does that suggest that we are good at participating in things that involve teams and group activities, but we're not great at motivating ourselves?
So it would indicate, because sport's on the decline, and generally speaking that's team-based, it would indicate, I think, that we are shifting to more do it on my terms, not on the terms of someone else. So being told that practice is on Tuesdays and Thursdays and the game's on Saturday works great if you're that type of person that you want to run your life around that. But for a lot of people, it's like, well, I've got family, I've got to cook dinner every day, so I don't have time to do that after work. I can go at lunchtimes though. And so again, sport is great, but it's part of the solution. We focus too much on sport as a solution to physical activity. We need to look at sport, we need to look at recreation, and then we look at what we call incidental activity. That's cycling to work, because all of these contribute to an active nation. And if we're going to do this properly, we need to get government behind this, because
how so, Richard? How so, Richard? Because the question is now, how do we get people off their butts again and moving? And if we put sport to one side, as you were suggesting, focus on other things, and you're saying the government has to get involved, I mean, what are they going to do? Physically push us off the couch?
Well, what the government needs to involve, the government doesn't need to provide the activities, because we've got the providers that are already doing that. If the government is serious about this, in the same way that we tax cigarettes, we need to incentivise the right behaviour for physical activity. And so, and I'm not saying that everyone necessarily gets some sort of low cost or a subsidy. What we're saying there is that what we want to do is actually get something that will help people and incentivise them to do the right behaviour.
Really appreciate your time, Richard. Richard Beattie there from Exercise New Zealand. Interested in your thoughts on that. What will it take to get you off the couch and moving? Are you less motivated after COVID? And should the government, subsidise some activities? Text us 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. New Zealand Rugby believes the rash of red cards in the last round of Super Rugby was an anomaly, and they're confident new guidelines around dangerous play will reduce the number of concussions in the game. Red cards have been one of the biggest talking points of Super Rugby so far, as World Rugby's zero-tolerance crackdown on dangerous contact with the head and neck continues. Rugby reporter Joe Porter reports.
Players were sent off in each of the first 4 round 7 matches of Super Rugby, and suspensions have followed, with the Blues wing Caleb Clark to face the judiciary tonight. The Blues prop Nepo Laulala was given his marching orders during last Tuesday's game against Moana Pacifica, meaning red cards were given out in 5 straight matches. All the cards followed contact to the head and neck area of an opposition player. New Zealand Rugby's national referee manager Bryce Lawrence isn't concerned by the number of players being sent from the field.
There's no difference to last year, where across the 2 Super in Aussie and New Zealand, we ended up with about 1 red card in every 5 games, and the stats exactly the same this year, if not a little lower. I actually think last week was a bit of a one-off.
Lawrence says the cards didn't affect the contest in last round's matches, with 4 of the 5 sides who had players sent off going on to win. And he believes the crackdown on contact to the neck or head will result in fewer concussions.
The absolute goal, and I think Alan Gilpin, the World Rugby CEO, came out this week and reiterated, is player safety at all levels. And I think over time, the continued focus will improve things.
Players found guilty of red card offences aren't currently punished financially, and Lawrence says fines could also help.
I'd imagine most of us, if we're hit in the pocket, when we pay a speeding ticket or something, it hurts a little bit, doesn't it?
Lawrence is hopeful there won't be as many cards this round, with the first game between the Highlanders and Moana Pacifica on Friday night in Dunedin.
It is 16 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. As more reports of potential war crimes emerge from Ukraine, Western leaders are tightening sanctions on Russia. US will be targeting Russian banks, officials and their families. The EU is proposing banning imports of coal. Here in New Zealand, the government has announced it will apply 35% tariffs to all imports from Russia. It's the country's most significant economic response to the invasion to date. Overnight, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky made an impassioned address to the UN Security Council. He's accusing Russian forces of committing the worst atrocities since World War II and says the Council has failed. The ABC's Isabella Higgins reports.
Slowly, residents from the small town of Wanaka sift through rubble. They find their battered belongings next to bodies of their family and neighbours. A local man named Anatole says his life has been reduced to ruins.
Right now, we came to see what happened. Everything you see, this is what's left of our lives. Please take a look.
It was images just like this that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky took directly to the UN Security Council. He played a graphic video while detailing the horrific crimes he claims have been inflicted on his people.
In the memory of the civilians who died, who were shot in the back of the head and killed after being tortured. Some of them were shot in the streets. Others were thrown down wells. So they died there, suffering.
Ukraine's leader questioned the value of the 15-member UN Security Council, which currently allows Russia to have veto power. Volodymyr Zelensky says the UN's highest body should have done more in the wake of the invasion and called on it to reform its structure or reconsider its existence.
If your current setup has no other alternatives and there's simply no solution, then it only means self-dissolution. Ukraine needs peace. We need peace. Europe needs peace. The world needs peace.
But Russia's ambassador to the Council, Vasily Nebenzia, used his address to categorically deny Ukraine's claim and insist Russia was on a peace mission.
We came to Ukraine, not to conquer lands. We came to bring the long-awaited peace to the blood-soaked land of Donbass. Not a truce, but a true lasting peace.
One of the US's UN ambassadors, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, says it's time Moscow was suspended from the UN Human Rights Council. Comments now are echoed by President Joe Biden.
This moment requires responsible world powers and global leaders to show some backbone and stand up to Russia's dangerous and unprovoked threat against Ukraine and the world.
Now the West is tightening sanctions against Russia. The EU has unveiled a ban against coal exports and maritime vessels entering EU ports.
Millions of people in the Chinese city of Shanghai remain in lockdown as health officials try to contain an outbreak of COVID. More than 13,000 daily cases have been recorded as around 26 million residents wait for the stay-at-home orders to lift. Some parents have been separated from COVID-positive children as the Chinese government continues its strict COVID-0 policy. The ABC's Bill Birtles describes what's happening on the ground in Shanghai.
For China, they have never seen daily case figures like this. Even in the earliest stage of the global pandemic in Wuhan, there was no day where we saw anything like 13 or 14,000 cases. So lockdown is literally you are forced to stay in your apartment. In some compounds, you might be able to walk out and go for a stroll, but the reports I've been seeing is that the local community organisations, which are sort of like a body corporate or a strata committee, but a lot more powerful, they organise the food deliveries, but a lot of people have been trying to get food delivered themselves, the equivalent of something like, Uber Eats. And Shanghai has actually been suffering food shortages because the supply lines have been affected by the lockdown. So it's quite an extraordinary situation. You can understand why there's so much frustration in the city when people can't go out. There's no timeline on when they will be allowed to go out. And then for those who do test positive, whether they have any symptoms or not, they're forcibly packed off to an isolation centre or a hospital. And that, of course, is causing great stress as well because we've seen the conditions in the isolation centres are not particularly good. This has caused huge anger, particularly in the past few days when videos emerged of very young children, toddlers, even babies being grouped together in hospital beds. These infants had tested positive to COVID and they'd been taken away from their parents to be treated in a special hospital facility. Now, when these videos came out, it caused fury on the Chinese internet, and the Shanghai officials came out and defended the policy. They said, look, we think it's a very important part of a COVID-0 approach. The current policy is unless both mother and baby or father and baby both have COVID, then they get separated. School of thought is that the Chinese hospital system actually is not that good, and that if they did live with the virus, there would be a huge surge of people descending on hospitals. There would be, just because of the large population, a pretty big death count. But I think the political reason is maybe even a bigger factor, because Xi Jinping, China's leader, has made such a big deal domestically about China's handling of the pandemic. saying literally China cares more about human rights than Western countries because Western countries allow people to die. They allow older people to get COVID and die, whereas in China we do everything we can to stop COVID and we save lives. And also, too, in Chinese state media, they constantly highlight how many deaths there have been in the US, in Britain. So it's been hugely politically advantageous for Xi Jinping and the Chinese government to have this policy. It's been very popular at home, even though the borders are shut. Most of the time, life goes on as normal without any COVID. So you can understand it would take one heck of a backflip to live with the virus, particularly after the Chinese government for the past year or so has stigmatised anyone who has publicly called for living with the virus.
4 days ago, Sri Lanka introduced draconian state of emergency laws to deal with protesters who are angry about shortages of fuel and food. But yesterday, the president revoked the measures. It followed the collapse of his coalition, with many of his former allies resigning. On the streets, the protests continue and they blame the president for the crisis. The BBC Rajani Vaidyanathan reports from Colombo.
Well, it's been another day of protests across Sri Lanka, and we're here in Colombo at Independence Square. There's a large crowd that's been gathering here. Many of them are calling for President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to leave office. Some of them have been chanting things like saying, "Go to the moon, President Rajapaksa." Huge pressure on the president, but he remains in office. Now that's despite a day of intense politics at Parliament today. More than 40 MPs quit his coalition government, and the new finance minister left his role after less than 24 hours in the job. Now, away from the political, the personal suffering continues. People still say they're struggling to get hold of cooking gas and petrol for their cars. And I was talking to two labourers earlier who say that even the cost of a basic bag of rice has now become prohibitively expensive. The country is still experiencing regular power cuts. The power in this area also went off recently as well. That just gives you an idea of the suffering, and people here are asking, even if the government eventually falls, which for the moment doesn't look like it's happening anytime soon, what will be the solution in this deepening economic crisis, and how will Sri Lankans have a way forward?
2 notebooks written by Charles Darwin have been returned to Cambridge University Library more than 20 years after they went missing. Now, the notebooks, which include the scientist's famous Tree of Life sketch, are worth many millions of dollars. Their return comes 15 months after the library concluded they had probably been stolen and launched a global appeal for help in trying to find them. But as the BBC's Rebecca Jones reports, mystery still surrounds who took them and where have they been.
Darwin's priceless, precious notepads are carefully lifted out of a special security case. They've been missing for more than 2 decades, and Dr. Jessica Gardner, the librarian at Cambridge University, is delighted to have them back.
I feel joyous. They're safe, they're in good condition, they're home, they're just where they should be. I couldn't be more pleased.
So tell me, how and where were the notebooks found?
Well, they were returned anonymously, and they were left in a public part of the library building. They were returned in a large pink gift bag. Inside that gift bag was a large brown envelope. Forgive me smiling, but on that envelope was a short message, just 3 words: librarian, happy Easter, and a cross or an X. And inside that was a tightly wrapped in cling film parcel. And we could glimpse through the cling film notebook B and notebook C, which is the labels for what we've been looking for such a long time.
Talk me through what went through your mind.
It's still hard to express. I was shaking. You can hear that in my voice.
Did you cry?
Can I say that? There have been tears. There have been tears, and I think there still will be, because we're not over the emotional roller coaster. It means so much to us to have these home.
The notebooks were last seen in November 2000 when they'd been removed to be photographed. It was only during a routine check 2 months later that they were found to be missing. Despite various searches, they never turned up. Dr. Gardner eventually concluded that they had probably been stolen. One of the notebooks features a spindly sketch of a tree of life, which helped inspire Darwin's theory of evolution.
The theory of natural selection and evolution is probably the single most important theory in the life and earth environmental sciences. And these are the notebooks in which that theory was put together.
Jim Secord is Emeritus Professor of History and Philosophy of Science at Cambridge University.
These are probably the most important manuscripts in the natural sciences.
He was among the many academics, conservators, archivists and experts who helped confirm the notebooks that have been returned are authentic.
Darwin uses different types of ink in the notebooks. For example, on the famous Tree of Life page, there's both a brown ink and also a later grey ink. And those kind of issues are quite difficult to forge convincingly at all. There's the type of paper that they're actually using. Where the clasp is on the notebooks, you can see little bits of copper where it's actually been eroded away. These are the tiny telltale signs that the whole team of researchers at the University Library can use to tell that they're genuine.
So many questions still remain unanswered, though. Who took the notebooks? Who brought them back? Here's what we know. They were left outside Dr. Gardner's office, where there are no security cameras.
Like many other buildings, we don't have CCTV in places where people are just regularly just passing through, and these were left on a landing. We have passed the CCTV that we have available to the police, and that's a matter for their live investigation.
Where do you think they've been?
It is a mystery. The only thing I can say is that they're in good condition. So they haven't been handled much. They've clearly been looked after with care wherever they have been. And for whatever reason, they are now back.
Back in a strong room with restricted access and CCTV. Although everyone will have a chance to see the notebooks for themselves when they go on public display in Cambridge in July.
What a remarkable mystery. Let's get to some of your final feedback here. This one on the United Nations and the need for reform. Pete's got in touch to say New Zealand needs to call for a truce in the Security Council now between America, China and Russia. We only have a few short years to slow global warming. What if we win the war but lose the world? No peace, no future. Thanks for getting in touch, Pete. And Raywin, reflecting on long COVID, says, I'm reflecting on a concept that has all but disappeared, convalescence. We used to understand that people need time to heal after a significant illness, weeks, not days, she says. That is pretty much all we have time for. Don't forget, the Late News team will keep you posted throughout the night. They've got you covered there. But if you missed anything from the program, you can find Checkpoint on Spotify, Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. Ko te kaupapa tuatahi a pōpō, and tomorrow from 5 a.m, first up's in Te Puke, finding out if you can really earn $60 an hour picking kiwi fruit. Now that is going to be an interesting one. Kaua e wariwari te atatero e a mātou kōrero. Don't forget you can go online and check out all our videos and our stories on Checkpoint's page. Thanks for joining us. Have a fantastic evening. Kia pai tōpō.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Kia ora tātou, I'm Evie Ashton. The accuracy of rapid antigen test numbers are being called into question with a leaked memo saying fewer than 1 million test results have been reported. 3 of the country's top health officials, including Director General Ashley Bloomfield, are calling it quits. The New Zealand government is imposing a 35% tariff on all Russian imports for its invasion of Ukraine.